Yeah, in 1986, I went to University of Connecticut, School of Dental Medicine in Farmington, Connecticut. I graduated in 1990 at the head of my class, went into oral surgery residency at LSU, and then after I was probably in about, I guess it was 4 or 5 years, then I switched into neurosurgery as part of my oral surgery training. It was a combined double degree program, meaning you got the dental and the medical degree. So I had already had it. So switching into neurosurgery was actually pretty easy. It wasn't difficult at all.
What did you learn in dental school about fluoride?
That it's really good for you and you should put it on your teeth, and it helps harden the enamel, you know, and to be quite honest with you, when I went to dental school, the oral biology class that we took, I thought was pretty lame, to be quite honest with you. They focused more on the anatomy and physiology of the teeth so that you would learn that. And I don't really remember having that many lectures on fluoride and not too many people talking about it. It was kind of just groupthink. And no one really questioned it. I actually don't remember anybody in dental school questioning it. The only thing I remember people questioning at that time, and this was in the beginning of the amalgam scare, we did that. But I don't really remember too much around the fluoride issue.
Did you learn about fluorosis?
Oh yeah, I actually had fluorosis on my central incisor. So I knew about that a long time ago, and I got that because I grew up in New York City, and the water there is heavily fluoridated. And in fact, when I went to New York City public schools, there was a period of time, I think from first grade to fourth grade, where they actually used to give us fluoride pills. You know, I think it was once a week or once a month. But I distinctly remember taking that, and we used fluoridated toothpaste. We used mostly Crest when I was growing up, or whatever was the cheapest thing on sale. And I used fluoridated toothpaste all the way until I was probably 40 years old. Then at 40 years old, everything changed.
Is that when you learned about fluoride, or?
No, that's when I learned about a lot of different things, but I realized truly what the problem with fluoride was. And it has to do with the biophysics of water. It has to do with the biophysics of cells. And it's kind of next level stuff. You know, most people stop that, oh, it's a toxin, it's a chemical waste product of, you know, manufacturing that Rockefeller wanted to use instead of, you know, costing him money. If he could put it in other things like drugs, it would be a beneficial thing. And then the one thing we did learn about in dental school, I just thought about it, we did learn about the public health situation tied to it, and that there was a little bit of controversy in different places, but pretty much it's gone away. I remember the one thing they said about Connecticut, they told us the towns that had unfluoridated water. That was probably the number one thing that I remember, and that if you happen to practice in those areas, and I wasn't from Connecticut, I'm from New York City, there was no way I would stay in Connecticut, that you may want to consider putting kids on that. And I do remember when I was a junior, I think, or a senior, when I was in the clinical rotations, asking some of the prosthodontists and the restorative dentists about the fluorosis on my central incisor. You know, could anything be done about it? You know, because I was in dental school, I wanted to learn something. And the interesting thing is they told me no. And you know, the funny thing is I believed that all the way till I was 40 years old. And if you look real close, there's no more fluorosis on it. So there is ways to reverse it.
What do you suggest is how do people reverse it?
Well, the number one way is to improve their redox potential in their body. And that gets into the biophysics aspect of what the redox potential means. For those who don't know, it's the net negative charge in the cell. That's the easy way to do it. I like to tell people to make it even simpler. Think about your body like a Ferrari. Think about the redox potential as the battery in the car and maybe the alternator. And what that does, it keeps the electrical potential pretty negative. Like in a mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, that's the seat of the redox potential. If you look at the difference between cytochrome 1 and oxygen, It's about negative 400 millivolts. When you use fluoride in anything, it reduces it dramatically. Then it also has a massive effect on the water that our mitochondria makes. And as I told you a little while ago, most people don't even know that our mitochondria make water. And that process starts with something, everybody learned in 3rd grade. If you take CO2 and water, put it together with sun, you make sugar. That's called photosynthesis. Everybody realized that, but people don't realize that animals reverse the process. They take sugar in and they break it down to CO2 and water. Turns out that the water that your mitochondria makes is a different kind of water than comes out of your tap, and a different kind of water that comes out of your municipal supply, or say spring water, or any type of water that you can imagine. It's called deuterium depleted water. And why is that important? Most people probably listening to this don't know what deuterium is, but it's an isotope of hydrogen. I think everybody knows that water is H2O. So the H is the hydrogen part. It turns out that when you have deuterium in water, it has massive effects on the electrical properties of water. And it turns out in nature, which we are now in beautiful Vermont, that during the day when the sun's out, there's many more electric fields in and around us, and our bodies and our mitochondria sense that, and it actually has an effect on the water. And that's the really unusual part of the biophysics. Most people don't realize that you can bury more light energy when the sun is out than when nighttime's out, because when nighttime comes, the electric fields of the sun drop, and then we have huge magnetic fields. So magnetic flux from the earth is present at nighttime. And that actually helps drive different regeneration programs in our body. But the key is, fluoride happens to really affect, if you really want to get down to it, the technical term for it is called the dielectric constant. So let's just assume you're back in Green Bay and you have non-fluoridated water coming out. If we were to do biophysical studies on that water, the dielectric constant on that water would be about 78. Okay, when sunlight hits the water, that dielectric constant starts to go up. It turns out when the water is made by your mitochondria and the sun hits it, the dielectric constant of that water is 160. So you can see it's double. So it's a massive effect. And it turns out, depending on the amount of fluoride that you have, either say from a natural spring, or the classic thing that I talk to people about is people who tend to live in Arizona and New Mexico think they're in good shape from my perspective, a mitochondriac perspective. I tell them the number one thing that's a problem there is the water there is terrible because it's naturally fluoridated by the rocks out there. So it's got a much higher fluoride level than normal, and it actually affects the type of plant growth. In fact, most people who really understand ecologic biology know that it's a geopathic stress zone for many reasons, but one of the main reasons is the water that's present there. It's scarce, but it also happens not to have a high dielectric constant. So it affects plants. It affects the things that can grow, and anything that affects plants, anything that affects photosynthesis affects us. Why? Because the entire food web on this planet is tied to the photosynthetic pathways. There's 3 of them, C3, C4, and CAM. The ones that most people need to worry about is C3. 80% of the plants on Earth are C3 plants. So fluoride can be bad. Like say if you think you're buying organic fruit from California, I can tell you that that is a complete corporate marketing phrase. Nothing in California is really organic because of the geoengineering and the bad water they got. Plus the water there has got a lot of deuterium in it. So when you understand that, that affects how much energy can be buried in the food source for you to eat at your table. And believe it or not, we're in a time now in 2018. A lot of people don't know this, but corporations like Whole Foods, Walmart, and Target, who sell food, they now are testing their food coming in by cutting the fruit open and using optical scanners to measure the biophotons that are released in the fruit or the vegetable, and if it doesn't meet a certain level, it can't be sold as organic. So they turn around to the farmer and tell them that we can't certify this as organic. That's how different the changes are happening. And to me, that's a good thing for people who are concerned about fluoride, because if the farmers use heavy irrigation that's fluoridated, the biophoton measure out of those fruits will not be good. So even they may sell it in Walmart. I doubt that they will, because Walmart's so tight with a buck. They could do it in Whole Foods, because the guy that just bought Whole Foods, I wouldn't trust him if he was on fire. But you need to be careful with that. I think in the next probably 3 to 5 years, commercial optical scanners are going to be available for people. So if you're really concerned about the water in the photosynthetic process, because really every food on this planet has water added into it because of photosynthesis, and water can be fluoridated. It can be fluoridated by man, or it can be fluoridated by nature, and you kind of need to know what that issue is, especially if you're trying to reverse a disease. You know, that's the people that I take care of. The people that have pretty serious diseases need as good a battery as possible to try to reverse the disease. So you need to look for the extraneous places that fluoride can get, you know, into your environmental milieu, so to speak. The major one is water, food's another, drugs, especially in my job as a neurosurgeon. People are shocked by almost every over-the-counter drug has fluoride in it. For example, if you look at Lexapro or Prozac and you look at the chemical formula, your head will explode. People don't realize that. You know, the drugs that have the really bad rep, even with doctors, but they got an FDA black box warning, which is the fluoroquinolones, which are antibiotics that were commonly given out. The most common one was ciprofloxacin. When I was a resident, that was a brand new drug, and it got used a lot. One of the problems with that medication, if you don't know, people get a lot of ACL tears, Achilles tears, like ligament tears. I see a lot of back problems, like degenerative disc disease with annular tears, and they get black discs. Like the disc, the way I describe it to my patients, is like an Oreo cookie. Someone ate your white stuff, so the cookie gets closer together and pinches the nerves. And when you have somebody it's taken in a lot of fluoride or has a low redox, that's the kind of stuff that we look for. And me being a dentist, obviously it helps me out. I'm always looking at people's teeth. So if I see that they have fluorosis on their enamel and they've got a bad MRI, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what's going on. And to be very honest with you, I think if your redox potential is really good and you're healthy, these are small issues. The problem right now in the United States, most of our country, out of 360 million people, probably 200 million people have low redox potentials. And the really sad part for me is we now have women or having babies who are born into this world with low redox potentials. We have a name for that. It's called a high heteroplasmy rate. And heteroplasmy has to do with that mitochondria. And basically the way to describe it to people who are non-science people, it's like having a 1970s Ferrari and comparing it to a 2018 Ferrari. They're still Ferraris, they still go fast, but one runs a lot better than the other. And it turns out the reason this happens in women and babies, and it's not that I'm trying to be sexist, it's actually biology, you only inherit your mitochondrial DNA from your mom. So anytime somebody becomes a member of my site or on Patreon and they ask me questions, the first thing I want to do with them, I want to know about their mom and their grandmother. And many women are shocked to hear about this because they don't realize the egg that they became first was in their mother when their mother was inside their grandmother. So that means grandma changed the epigenetics of that egg, and then it was changed further by mom's whole life until she had you, and then you usually have an opportunity to change it your whole life. But when it comes to a kid, the single most important time from the mitochondrial genome situation is the first 6 years of their life. So say if somebody is ignorant about redox potential or ignorant about fluoride, you could be setting your kid up for problems down the road, especially when you consider all the other mitochondrial toxins that are now in our environment to a much greater degree than most people want to know.
Do you know the history of like why they put fluoride in our drinking water? Well,
it's controversial. You know, the history that I have researched that I believe goes back to what I said before. It goes right back to Rockefeller. Rockefeller was trying to pay back the federal government for breaking up Standard Oil, and he figured out ways to do that, and he basically took all his little bits and pieces and parts of Standard Oil, and one of the excess chemicals that were made in his chemical factories was fluoride, and he told his engineers he wanted to figure out, instead of throwing this stuff into the rivers, which they did, could they do something from a manufacturing standpoint? And he started to use it in industrial chemicals, and then eventually through his foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation that's in New York, that's where Big Pharma really came from. Every big pharmaceutical company comes from that breakup point from Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s. And most of them now use fluoridated compounds. And the reason people use that is because it's the most electronegative atom on the periodic table. So it's really easy to control other atoms when you use it. The interesting thing that I actually talked to my professors about when I was in dental school, actually in medical school and residency, it's kind of interesting. There's no biologic chemicals that I know of that have fluoride in it. In fact, the chemical that we used with the highest electronegativity, and I'm talking from a natural standpoint, meaning molecular biology, is oxygen. We don't go past oxygen on the periodic table. If you look at the periodic table, fluorine and oxygen are right in the same row. But it turns out fluorine's in group 7 and oxygen's in group 6. So they're right next to each other. So biology stopped there for a reason. I always tell people, when nature does something, even if you think it's small, don't blow it off. It's really important for a reason. And it turns out the real reason for it is fluorine, because it has 7 electrons in its valence shell. It wants that other electron because that makes it inert. In other words, it becomes not a problem at all. And it turns out that life uses electrons. It needs it to move around. And when you have a fluoride or a fluoride ion or fluorine in it through metabolism, it can lose an electron and become very, very toxic inside. And most people need to understand the chemicals that you have, say, in a pill, it's not in ionic form. It's usually a stable compound. The problem is when you eat it or take it, it's getting processed, then it can become an ion, and then it can cause havoc in your body. And the problem is no one's really done, as far as I'm concerned, good enough studies out there. You know, there's been several studies in the last couple of years, I know from Harvard, where they've really pounded that, hey, this is a real big issue. And I think there is an impetus now to try to get back and maybe get rid of fluoride, because to be honest with you, caries, which are dental decay, are not that big a deal in dentistry anymore. It used to be a huge big deal, and I think it's going to be less of a big deal going forward because of the way dentists are now training and what they're doing. It's more cosmetic. They're using less metal. And to be quite honest with you, dentistry has really gotten away from, okay, kids are eating jelly beans all day, so we need to make their teeth, stronger. The sad part is, when I was in dental school, one of the things that the dentist told me in Connecticut is, look, if we get people to seal their teeth, we won't have to use fluoride. Turns out the sealants have fluoride in them, which I thought was really ironic. And the funny thing is, I still have my sealants on my teeth from dental school, and they're just in the deep fissures. All the other stuff wore away after all this time. But it's kind of like you replace one thing with another thing and another thing, and the fluoride is kind of still there. It just really depends on the person who gets it. Someone with a low redox is going to have a really bad reaction to some of these things, but the flip side of this is, someone who's got a really good redox, it's going to be just like any other toxin in the environment. They're able to handle it. And that's what makes, fights against the EPA, fights against the FDA, fights against Big Pharma really difficult, because fluoride affects cells. All cells work non-linear. What does non-linear mean? Non-linear means you take a small stimulus and it leads to a massive amplification. In someone who has a low redox potential, fluoride can cause a nonlinear effect. In other words, you could take it and wind up either with a cancer or an autoimmune condition, where someone else could take it for 50 or 60 years because they live in the right location, they live the right way, they're out in the sun all the time, they drink the right kind of water, and they really live an outdoor life and not an indoor life. They won't have a problem with it. And the problem is the companies, the government agencies, they use that against people because their paradigm is a randomized controlled clinical trial. And here's the irony. You take 1 million people, you put them in a study, and you get an average result. In other words, we're judging things based on mediocrity. Here's the irony, and this is why I'm a little bit hopeful things are going to change soon. It just came out in Nature, that's a big science journal, that personalized medicine, meaning N=1 medicine, is now really beginning to get pushed. And why is that good? Because the paradigm of Rockefeller, the Flexner Report, Big Pharma, Big Medicine, has always been about DNA, meaning nuclear genome. Most of your people watching this don't realize you got another genome in you. That's the mitochondrial genome. And guess what the new science says? That genome is more important than this one. In fact, this genome keeps this one quiet. When this one gets too active, that's when all hell breaks loose. And it turns out that in nature, they're beginning to realize that you cannot take people and do a randomized controlled trial and call it evidence-based medicine. Now, what I just told you, if you went to talk to 98 other doctors, or 98% of doctors, they don't even know that because they haven't read the damn paper that just came out last week. And I posted about it to my members and on the forum, and I said, look, this is a good sign. Even if it takes 15 or 20 years to get into medicine, it's a great sign because it tells you that the top of the pyramid is starting to realize that the paradigm of belief that we create our algorithms from is deeply flawed. And unfortunately, most of the fluoride studies back in the 40s and the 50s, guess where they were studied? Randomized controlled clinical trials. And most of them had big time flawed methodologies, but nobody cares about that now. Why? Because fluoride's everywhere and nobody's bitching and moaning about it enough like they are other things. My personal belief, and I told you this before we started the interview, you probably weren't too happy about it, but I really believe that if a person is taught the biophysics, that they can do a really good job with fluoride. Now, they're going to have to do a couple of things in their life differently than maybe everybody else. And, you know, some people may look at this from a libertarian standpoint and say, why are we giving people toxins? You know, and I get that. I look at it like this. I don't wait for the federal government to do anything to keep my health well. I am my own boss. I am the CEO of me, and everybody that I teach, that includes doctors, clinicians, functional medicine doctors, all my mitochondriacs, it's an N=1 game. And you need to know that, you need to have that mindset, and you need to understand functionally how this really matters to you. And when you do, then I think you can make good decisions, because the worst thing you can do in any branch of medicine, in any alternative medicine field, is to take a half-truth and think it's smart, because it's always going to turn out to a full lie. And one of the things that I've learned in my dental and medical career, most of the things that were put in by a USB drive into my head have turned out to be false after a period of time. So the key for a mitochondriac, or a key for somebody who's trying to go against the EPA on the fluoride issue, is you need to realize you have to unlearn what is not true. And you're going to have to bang your head against people who believe it is true. And you have to understand their perspective. That makes this fight very interesting, because the best way to describe it, and I'm trying to be kind here, most of the people in a paradigm suffer from the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is they're not aware of data that they don't know that really affects the big picture. And the thing is, when they become aware of it, they're kind of shocked. And it happens all the time. And I would tell you, for most of the things that are out there today, in my opinion, we've gotten so far away from nature that most of the things that we do you could say that there's a Dunning-Kruger aspect to them. The problem is you as the person, this is part of what my passion is to teach people to be a mitochondriac, because what are mitochondriacs? They go to the nth degree because they're intensely curious. In other words, wherever everybody else gets tired of thinking, we go deeper. And that's part of the reason why I mentioned to you about the dielectric constant of water. All you need to know from a fluoride standpoint about that, it means you can't bury as much UV or infrared A light. What does that mean? That means the battery, no matter what you do, even though I put you naked outside on the equator, and you did everything organic and lived a wholesome life, but you kept using fluoride, you would not do well long term. If you were already toxic. Now, if you just started doing it and you were okay, it probably have no effect on you because you're able to detox it. Well, not only that, the big argument with fluoride too, the enamel is, you may not know this, do you know it's a fluorophore meaning it's made out of a UV protein. No bullshit. So when you think about this, here you're using fluoride that affects the ability for that protein to work. And it works with your saliva through a very complex pathway. So when you put fluoride in it, you're effectively affecting the longevity of that tooth, which is my personal opinion now. That's the reason why the ADA is so big into fluoride, because it's planned obsolescence. It makes your teeth worse long term, so that you have to have more dental care. That's really what I think their goal is, and I think they've known it for a long time. I just can't prove it. But it's blatantly obvious when you understand the biophysics of water. The people I talk to in the ADA, they don't know shit about biophysics. They are conventional biochemical paradigm people. And it's convenient for them. Why? Because in the biochemical paradigm, you cannot, there's no way to explain this. There really isn't. And that's why when you ask me to talk to you, my perspective is decidedly different than everybody else, because I come at this from an electromagnetic standpoint. Everybody needs to realize mitochondria only deal with electrons and protons. When I was in dental school, I didn't know one dentist that knew anything about electrons and protons. That includes the guys teaching me. And I didn't know about it until even after medical school. I don't think people in medical school really, truly understand how powerful it is. And when you begin to understand the foundations of how something really works, then you can put the pieces apart. And the great thing about being a doctor or a dentist, we see patients all the time, we see them fall apart. So when you see them fall apart, and then you start seeing how they come together, then you actually become a better clinician. Then you start going, yeah, I don't want to give you an antibiotic that's got fluoride in it. In other words, you're concerned about it right off the bat. But the problem is, most of the guys in medical school now in residency, they don't even know that ciprofloxacin has fluoride in it. They have no clue. And when you mention it to them, then you tell them that's why the black box warning's there. They're like, really? I'm like, well, I use fluoride toothpaste. I'm like, well, maybe you want to think about that. Or if you use it, make sure you don't swallow it. But you're still going to get sublingual injection, because I usually tell them, where do we put people with heart failure's nitroglycerin? Right under their tongue. Where do you think that waste toothpaste is going? And they kind of wake up. When you actually make it tangible that they can understand it, the big problem with glial cells, remember what they do. They have lots of different functions, but they're the clearinghouse mechanism in the brain. They do a lot of damage control. So if they get fluoridated, meaning if their electrons are tied up, they cannot be as dynamic as they need to be to do their job. And if you have, say, things that need to be cleared up, and the damage that I'm talking about is like damage from mitophagy or autophagy or apoptosis, or lipofuscin. There's so many different chemicals that are in these pathways that cells have to either recycle or completely regenerate. Fluoride slows that process. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, again, you can see I'm a big analogy guy, when you have a glial cell that is impacted by this and has a lower redox, my example to you to give to some other scientist, it's equivalent to being in a Home Depot warehouse where arrivals and deliveries come at the same day instead of coming as they're supposed to come, maybe on Monday and Tuesday. And when that happens, the cell gets overwhelmed. When the cell gets overwhelmed, then its redox further is pushed down. And then function goes lower. And this continually happens over time. And what happens, then you can't repair the damaged power plants in these cells. Then their basic physiologic function, what they're designed to do, no longer works. And that's when a patient manifests the disease. How do we see that? If we look under a microscope, if we take someone's glial cell out, which we don't want to do, but we look at it, we'll actually start to notice that the mitochondria in those cells are heteroplastic, meaning the heteroplasmy rate's gotten higher. And the way heteroplasmy works normally in people, what normal aging is, when you're really young, it's low. It's usually below 10%. Every decade you age, it goes up 10%. That's just a standard. So you can be, say, 20 or 30 years old and have a heteroplasmy of 60 or 70%. Say if you came from a bad egg and you've been using fluoride tablets, mouth rinses, washes, drinking water because you live in Sedona, or you live in Southern California, and no one ever told you about this. It's another cell inside the bone. It's called an osteoblast. An osteoblast is very similar to the enamel on your teeth. The only difference is we lose our ameloblasts, and you can't regenerate enamel. Only dentin does it from the inside. With bone constantly remodels. It's got the third highest metabolic rate in the body. The heart being number 1, the brain being number 2, and bone being number 3. So what did I say to you before about mitochondria? Anything that decreases its ability is going to affect the highest functioning tissues first. So that's going to be brain, the electrical conduction system of the heart, and then bone. So it's no shocker. What happens when you have a lower dielectric constant, you can't put enough UV in the water, and people don't realize this. When sunlight hits water, it makes something called an exclusion zone, and it changes the refraction of the water. It also changes the physics of the water, okay? It's completely different. One of the main things that it does, it actually affects the hydrogen bonding network. So what does it do? It favors H+, which is the ion of hydrogen, light hydrogen. When you have fluoride in the water, more deuterium gets into things that it shouldn't be in. And what does that do? It destroys the redox potential. That's part of the reason why it's a massive effect. And what people don't realize, that DNA is completely hydrated. If you look at the phosphate groups on the outside of the double helix, what do they bond to? Water. DNA can't work without water. So most people want to jump to the fluoride DNA stuff. That's the wrong place to be. You need to be at the water phase, because guess what? The way those protons talk to DNA is via proton tunneling, and it turns out in quantum physics, there's two big issues. One is energy and the other one's information. And the way things are shared, everybody knows about the energy of an electron. That's called the photoelectric effect. A certain photon hits an electron, excites it, and then it falls back to the ground state. That's how we transfer energy in biology. What they don't know is that protons have different quantum spin numbers too. Proton, that's H+, is a half. Deuterium is +1. Turns out H+ can move faster, and it carries more information. So when you have fluoride in your water that's affecting your DNA, can you transfer information? What is DNA? It's an electromagnetic coil that stores information magnetically. All the base pairs in DNA, the 4 of them, each one of them are magnetic. In fact, when you put UV light on them, they become more magnetic. Do you know why? They all have aromatic amino acids that absorb UV light between 200 and 400 nanometers.
You want fluoride and allergies?
Yeah, but again, you're going to be shocked to hear this. The number one cause of allergies, both food and any other kind, lack of vitamin D. It goes back to the sun again. Why? The sun is how we build our redox through water. So you have to realize the fluoride story really is a water story. And remember, when you're born, you're made up of 80% water. When you're my age, I'm about 60% water. So as we get older, it's kind of a big deal. And the reason why is because we don't make as much water from a mitochondria because our engines aren't as good. If you happen to be a kid born from a mother that's got really bad redox, that kid could be a train wreck. So using fluoride on a kid like that, that's going to be one of the other things that people start blaming, the allergies on. I'm going to tell you, put the kid in the sun and watch what happens. You'll be shocked, because it actually will help the hydrogen bonding network in their water. So I don't want to see people, I mean, I'd like to see fluoride eliminated, but the one thing you're going to learn about me, I don't like half-truths. And when somebody wants to blame it on this, they better really got the science down to a T. And as far as I'm concerned, there's better ways of tackling that problem than blaming it on something else. We're really famous for doing that in medicine, and I don't like it. Biofilms are a big issue. I mean, it's a big issue in the gut, it's a big issue in the mouth. That's part of the reason why, when you said to me earlier, do you think it helps either periodontal disease or decay? I don't think it helps at all, because it's really toxin for our bacteria. And the other thing, I'm pretty sure that sooner or later some microbiome researcher is going to put 2 and 2 together, saying, hey, you know why these kids are having problems? Because they're using, you know, a lot of fluoride. It's one of the things that when they do the microbiome studies, they should probably control for that, and they don't. It's one of the things they don't control for light, and they never control for, you know, their use of fluoride, because they don't realize that prokaryotes, which are what bacteria are, they don't really like oxygen, and they don't like fluoride for the same reason. They don't like anything that's electronegative. They like to move their electrons and protons around way more than we do. That's one of the key differences in the kingdoms of life. We happen to be the most complex, the eukaryotes, bacteria are prokaryotes, and then the other one are archaea. And archaea and bacteria have been on this planet for 3.8 billion years. They don't like oxygen, they don't like fluoride. How do enzymes work? Proton tunneling. But right back to the hydrogen bonding network. So it's no shock. Anytime you have fluoride present, it has a massive effect on proton tunneling. Proton tunneling is how every enzyme on this planet works. So if you have it in an aqueous solution, it will slow your enzyme kinetic rate down. In fact, the only halogen, and this is ironic, same group, group 7, the one that really helps, and this is one of the things that I teach people, especially if they have fluorosis on the teeth, they need to eat a lot of seafood with iodine in it. Iodine is a group 7 element. Iodine helps tremendously get rid of fluoride, but you need to do it with the sun. You need your skin exposed to get rid of it. That's how I got rid of my fluorosis.
Can you explain the fluoride in the thyroid?
Well, yeah, the fluoride in the thyroid is because iodine is concentrated. We have actually antiporters in our thyroid gland and in a part of our brain called the choroid plexus. And most people don't realize the choroid plexus makes CSF. Where does it make it? It makes it from your blood. So those two places, women in their breasts, they also have that same antiporter. You're designed to have iodine in high concentrations here, your boobs, and your brain. And the reason for that, when you put iodine in an aqueous solution, what does it do? It brings the protons closer together and allows them to tunnel faster. The name of that mechanism is called the Grothaus mechanism. And when you have fluoride in the system, it doesn't work as well as it does with iodine. The reason why iodine is different and it's a halogen, its atomic mass is way bigger than fluoride. See, fluoride's a really small atom, so its electron negativity is off the chart. Iodine has a really big nucleus, and it's got a shit ton of electrons. So that means its valence shell is very far away, so it's not as strong a halogen. So what can it do? Has a less of an effect. Just think about it. It's like having 2 weaklings pull my arms versus 2 really huge buff guys trying to pull me apart. That's really the difference. And people don't realize that issue with those 2 elements, but anybody who's got a real bad fluoride problem really needs to get a lot of iodine in their diet. And the way to do that, the best way, not from table salt, I want you eating seafood, especially shellfish. And I even tell, one of the biohacks that I did for my fluorosis, since I live in the South, we have big Gulf shrimp. And you know that when you peel the shrimp, you have that little foot on the end, and it usually leaves a collar on it, the chitin or the exoskeleton. Most people don't know this. It has more iodine in it than thyroid medicine does. So I used to eat, when I'd eat 12 shrimp, I'd eat 1 of that chitin to get my iodine in it. And that's part of the reason why shrimp, when you cook them, they turn a little bit red. It's the iodine that's in them, amongst other carotenoids that are present. So any kind of shellfish that you eat is good. The other thing is, if you have a fluoride issue and you're worried about it, seaweed. Eat seaweed once a week. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people talk about it. The interesting thing was when I was back in residency and early in my career, I did a lot of pineal surgery, and we used to send a lot of the tissue off. Most people's pineal glands are calcified. There's a big functional medicine myth out there that a lot of times the calcification of the pineal gland is due to fluoride. It turns out the real answer is actually it's their melatonin levels low. But guess what? It's still a fluoride story, because what causes low melatonin levels? Excessive fluoride in the system. So because it reduces the hydrogen bonding network in water, it turns out that melatonin is made from an aromatic amino acid that absorbs UV light. So we're back to the water story again. See, that's the key here. The key is you need to understand how this science ties in, because when you just put it out there and you can't explain it, I always tell people it's pseudoscience if you don't have an explanation.